This year marks 5 years since a military coup overthrew Egypt's democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. But not everyone is celebrating. In those 5 years, Egypt's new government has built 20 new prisons. That's probably because prisons have been filled to 3 times their capacity since the military took power. But these prisons aren't just filled with criminals. Many prisoners are political opponents, human rights defenders, journalists, and peaceful demonstrators. And they're picked up at protests or abducted and forcibly disappeared by Egyptian security forces. Just 7 years ago, these very people were at the front lines of the revolution that overthrew former dictator Hosni Mubarak and ushered in a new era in Egyptian history. But today, they've become Generation Jail. Human rights groups estimate that there are 60,000 political prisoners behind bars. But the Egyptian government denies these numbers.
We don't have any political prisoners. This is really important. We have real proceedings everyone goes through and is guaranteed by Egyptian law.
But Egyptian law has changed since President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took power. He's banned protesting without government approval, running for office without government approval, and visiting websites that the government deems a threat to national security. According to a new law, that could be any social media page with over 5,000 followers. And these proceedings that people go through, they're not exactly fair. Most people go through military courts. Egyptian authorities are accused of using military courts to avoid the legal protections offered to prisoners in regular courts. At least 15,500 civilians were tried in military courts, including more than 150 minors, in just 3 years of the regime. And the accused don't even get their own day in court, since the authorities have taken to trying them in mass trials. That's when hundreds of people are charged and sentenced at the same time. And the sentencing is harsh. Death sentences are popular. According to Human Rights Watch's director for the MENA region, they're given out like candy. In 2017, Egyptian courts gave out over 402 death sentences. That was the most in the region. And it's not getting better. Shortly after the coup in 2013, Egyptian military forces killed more than 800 protesters at a pro-Morsi sit-in and arrested over 700 protesters. Those protesters, along with members of the opposition and journalists who were present, were tried in a mass trial this year where 75 received death sentences. As for the hundreds killed at the sit-in, 5 years later, and not a single police officer has been brought to account. And things aren't any better in the prisons themselves. Solitary confinement is a popular punishment used against political opponents. It was described as crushing humanity by Amnesty International. And prisoner testimonies agree.
I was in solitary confinement for 4 years. I ate alone. I slept alone. I prayed to God alone. For 4 years, I broke my Ramadan fast by myself. What is this? Systematic killing?
Many journalists, human rights activists, and political opponents are detained with no reasonable charges and placed in indefinite solitary confinement. Al Jazeera's own Mahmoud Hussein has been unjustly imprisoned for over 600 days. He's been kept in solitary confinement, denied his legal rights, and has yet to be formally charged. Besides solitary, prisoners are tortured, underfed, and coerced into giving false confessions. So, getting sick is almost inevitable. But prisoners don't get the required care. The Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK reported that 427 prisoners died from medical negligence in just 3 years.
He wasn't sick or anything. I would tell him he'd get released and get married. I couldn't wait to pick him up from jail. So how was I given his corpse instead?
And while human rights organizations all over the world continue to report these abuses, Egyptian civil society organizations see otherwise.
I know Egyptian prisons to be better than any others anywhere in the world.
In terms of what?
Everything, from facilities, hygiene, healthcare, sports, and food. Even the prison officers are all very religious, with really good morals.
أخلاق عالية جدا جدا رقية جدا جدا.
None of the three reported torture or mistreatment.
Mass trials, arbitrary and random arrests, forced disappearances, and death by torture and medical negligence have all become hallmarks of Egypt's prison system. And yet, governments the world over